The air was getting cold because winter was starting, but the sun was still out, so I decided to walk home through the woods instead of using the noisy main road. I usually loved this path in the summer because of the green trees and the birds, but even in the winter it felt peaceful until I reached a small clearing and saw two young boys kneeling on the dirt. They had thrown their backpacks and jackets into the nearby bushes and were leaning so far forward that it looked like they were trying to put their heads into the ground. I watched them for a moment and heard one of them shout a silly word into the earth before they both started laughing hysterically as if it was the funniest thing in the world. I smiled because it seemed like normal kid stuff, and I was curious about what was captured their attention, so I walked closer to them. The boy wearing a yellow beanie with a pom-pom on top shouted another rude word, and they rolled around on the leaves in fits of giggles while the blonde boy screamed something else toward the soil. I asked them what they were doing out there all alone, since the woods can be lonely and the school nearby was already empty for the day. The boy in the yellow hat pointed at the ground and told me to look, so I leaned over, and my heart skipped a beat because I saw a hole that I had never noticed before in all my years of walking this trail. It was about the size of a large melon, and it was a perfect circle that went straight down into total blackness without any visible bottom. It looked too clean and too smooth to be made by an animal, and it felt like someone had used a giant drill to poke a shaft into the center of the earth right there in the middle of the forest. I asked them what it was, but the blonde kid just looked at me like I was stupid and said it was a hole, which didn't really help me understand why it felt so wrong. The boy in the yellow hat leaned over the edge and shouted a word into the dark, and that is when the fear started to crawl up my skin. The sound that came back wasn't a normal echo because it sounded like 100 different children were all screaming the same word back at us from deep under the ground. I tried to laugh it off, but the sound was too thick and too heavy, so I told the boys they should probably head home because the sun was going down. The blonde boy got very angry and told me not to tell them what to do, and his voice was suddenly much sharper than a child's voice should be. I tried to be nice and told them it wasn't safe to play near a deep drop in the dark, but they just ignored me and went back to staring into the void. I asked where their parents were, but they just huffed and told me to leave them alone, while the blonde one tossed a pebble into the darkness. I felt a deep dread in my stomach that told me to run away, but I couldn't just leave two small children alone next to a mysterious pit, so I kept trying to reason with them. They looked at each other with a strange expression like they shared a secret. And then the blonde boy told me that if I shouted something into the hole, they would finally leave. I was terrified of the hole, and I didn't want to go near it, but they started calling me a chicken and mocking me until I felt pressured to just get it over with so we could all go home. The boy in the yellow hat shoved his head back into the darkness to show me it was safe, and he screamed another insult into the deep. The echoes that came back were even louder this time, and they sounded warped and distorted like the voices were being twisted in a machine. I stepped to the edge and knelt down. But as I prepared to shout, I saw a tiny flicker of movement far below in the shadows, like something was reaching up or shifting in the dark. I jumped back in terror and asked them what was down there, but they just laughed at me and called me a wuss for being afraid of nothing. I decided I had enough and told them we were leaving right now, so I reached out to grab the blonde boy by the arm to pull him away from the edge. As soon as my hand touched his skin, his entire body twisted in a way that was physically impossible, and his arm felt like it was made of snapping dry wood. He began to scream a horrible sound and he started shaking violently while his friend joined in, and they both began to chant for me to yell into the hole over and over again. Their voices were high and manic, and then I realized that the hole was chanting along with them in a massive chorus of invisible children. I let go of him and stood there in shock as they writhed on the ground like they were having a fit, and the sound of the hole became a deafening roar of yell into it that filled the entire clearing. I turned around and ran as fast as I could through the trees while the voices chased me through the woods and echoed off every trunk and leaf. I didn't look back once because I felt like the darkness was right behind me, and I just wanted to see the lights of the street. I burst out of the bushes and onto the pavement just as a car was coming, and the headlights were the last thing I saw before the impact sent me into the black. I woke up in the hospital with broken bones and a head injury, and when the police asked me what happened, I tried to tell them about the hole and the kids. They looked at me with pity and confusion because they obviously thought I had lost my mind during the accident, and they didn't find any hole when they checked the woods. A few weeks later, I had to go to the police station to sign some papers, and I saw a wall covered in photos of people who had disappeared. My breath caught in my throat when I saw two specific photos of a blonde boy and a boy in a yellow pom-pom hat. I asked the officer who they were, and he told me they were local kids who had gone missing many years ago and were never found. I stared at their faces and remembered the way the blonde boy's arm had twisted under my touch, and the way their voices had merged with the screaming from the pit. I realized then that they weren't waiting for their parents, and they weren't playing a game because they had already been claimed by whatever lives at the bottom of that perfect circle in the dirt. I have thought a lot about whether I should share this story because every time I try to talk to Abigail about it, something strange seems to happen in the room around us. It all started last summer when my parents were fighting so much that the house felt like it was going to break apart, and my mom finally decided we had to leave in the middle of the night to stay with her mother. I had never met my grandmother before because my mom always acted strange when her name came up, but we drove into the hills until we reached a tiny town where the trees looked like they were closing in on the road. The house was old and smelled like cedar, and my grandmother gave me a hug that felt more like she was trying to hold on to me for safety than to say hello. She whispered that I should have stayed in the city, and that night at dinner she gave me one very important rule, which was to never go near the rusted fence at the back of the yard. The fence was covered in vines and sat right at the edge of a forest that looked so dark and thick that the sun never seemed to reach the ground inside of it. She told me that the things living out there did not like to be noticed, and she said it with such a serious look in her eyes that I felt a cold chill run down my back. I called my best friend Abigail because I was bored and scared, and she came to visit me for the weekend so we could hang out and try to ignore the weird feeling of the house. We spent our time taking pictures and walking to the local store, but our eyes kept drifting back to that old fence and the shadows behind the wire. We did not plan to break the rule, but on Saturday evening we found a spot where the fence was bent down toward the grass like something heavy had climbed over it. We stepped over the wire and entered the woods, and the air changed instantly because it became very still and quiet, as if all the birds and bugs had suddenly died. The trees were tall, and the branches looked like long fingers reaching down to grab at our hair while we walked along a tiny path. We found some old trash on the ground, which meant other people had been there before, but then we heard the sound of slow breathing coming from behind the trunks. It was a steady and calm breath that sounded like someone was standing right behind us and watching every move we made. Abigail asked if I heard it, and then we heard a loud snap of a branch, and we both started to scream and run as fast as we could. The forest felt like it was stretching out to keep us inside, and I tripped and cut my knee, but I didn't care because I just wanted to get away from the breathing. We climbed back over the fence, and I tore my skin on the metal, and we burst into the kitchen where my grandmother was waiting for us. She did not look surprised at all, and she just looked at Abigail and told her to make sure the window was locked for the night. We went to my room and huddled together under the blankets because we were too terrified to close our eyes in the dark. At 3 a.m, we heard a soft tapping on the window glass that sounded like long fingernails scratching against the pane. We were too scared to look at the window, and Abigail held my hand so tight that it started to hurt while we listened to the scratching continue for hours. When the sun finally came up, we looked at the glass and saw thin, oily marks from the tips of fingers that had been dragged across the window while we were hiding. We left the house that morning, and Abigail never spoke to me about that weekend ever again, because she deleted all her photos and even changed her phone number so she could forget. My grandmother passed away last month, and my mom asked if I wanted to go back to the house to help clean it out, but I told her I would never go near that town again. Even though I am far away in the city, I have started waking up at 3 a.m. every single night for no reason at all. I don't hear any tapping or scratching on the window anymore, but when I lie very still in the dark, I can hear that same slow breathing right at the foot of my bed. It is steady and patient, and it makes me realize that whatever was in those woods didn't stay behind the fence when we left. Losing a child is the hardest thing in the world, and the people who try to help you always talk about the sadness and the guilt. But they never tell you about the silence that follows, because once the house is empty, the quiet feels like it is pushing against your chest and making it hard to breathe. My daughter Sophie was gone, and for months I walked through my home like a ghost while my brain tried to play tricks on me by making me hear her little footsteps. or the sound of her laughing in the other room, only for me to remember that she was never coming back. These sounds started to follow me into my sleep, and I began to have terrible dreams about a dark thing coming out of the woods to stand under her window and call her name until I would wake up screaming in the dark. I became so afraid of my own bedroom that I started sleeping on the couch with the lights on because I felt like something real was watching the house from the edge of the trees. One night I heard a loud snap outside, and I grabbed my heavy knife and a flashlight to go check the yard, but I didn't find anything, even though I felt eyes on me from the shadows. This happened for 3 nights in a row until I finally saw the visitor moving across the field under the moon, and it was the most frightening thing I have ever seen because it didn't walk like a person but instead moved like a tangle of branches and rolling shadows. It came up to my house and began to tap on the glass and scratch at the doors while I hid inside with my knife and listened to it growling and rattling the handle like it was desperate to get inside. The front door finally broke open, and a monster made of rotted wood and old bone and scraps of skin stepped into my hallway, and it looked like a nightmare that had been put together by a cruel hand. It grabbed me with incredible strength, and I saw its face was a mess of dead skin and its mouth was sewn shut with wire while its eyes looked at me with a sadness that felt older than the world. The monster dragged me out of my house and across the grass while I fought and screamed, but it didn't stop until we were deep in the dark woods where the air smelled like damp earth and old leaves. It stood me up and forced me to look at a tree where a man named Mark was tied up with thick vines and roots, and he was covered in bruises and blood like he had been beaten for a long time. I knew Mark from the store down the road, and I couldn't understand why this monster had captured him, until the creature growled and Mark started to cry and confess that he was the one who had taken my daughter. He told me that he had tricked Sophie into following him because he was a bad man with a dark heart, and as he spoke I felt a fire start to burn inside my soul that made everything else disappear. I remembered my daughter's face and her smile, and the way I was just a few minutes late to meet her at the bus stop on the day she vanished, and the pain of it made me want to kill the man in front of me. I shouted that she had trusted him, and I tried to jump forward to stab him with my knife, but the monster caught me and threw my weapon away into the trees because it wanted me to see something else first. The creature pointed at a white sheet on the ground, and when I looked at the shape under the cloth my heart felt like it turned into a heavy stone, because I knew it was the body of my little girl. I had spent so long wondering where she was, but seeing the truth was almost worse than not knowing, because it meant the last bit of hope was finally gone forever. The monster looked at me with its dead eyes, and I realized it wasn't there to hurt me, but it was there to show me the truth, and to punish the man who had broken the rules of nature. The creature reached up to its own face and ripped the wires out of its mouth with a wet snap, and then it leaned over Mark and took his voice away in a way that I cannot describe. It looked back at me, and used its new voice to tell me to leave the woods and go home while it stayed behind with the man who had killed my child. I picked up the small bundle wrapped in the white sheet and held it close to my chest as I walked out of the forest while the sun began to rise over the hills. I walked all the way back to my house and I dug a grave right under my bedroom window so that Sophie could finally be at rest in a place where I could watch over her. I worked until the dirt was all piled back up, and when the sun was high in the sky, I looked toward the woods and saw a shadow standing there for one last moment before it faded away into the trees. The strange noises in the house finally stopped, and the silence wasn't scary anymore because I didn't have to wonder where she was and I could finally sit in the quiet and remember her the right way.